Okay, so this is going to be our last class on the Apostle Paul and magic and this, that, and the other thing. Not because I don't like it, but we've done it for a while now. I'm on to something else. We're on to Cincinnati. All right. So if you would, brothers and sisters, and if you want, there's no pressure, of course. In Acts, the 16th chapter, we're going to start there. And there's a couple things I want to just look at that relate, obviously, to the things that we were discussing last week as far as the slave girl. Remember the slave girl that her masters were using her to enrich themselves. You know, she was telling, she had some type of ability, divination or something like that, or people thought that she had it, and she was able to, quote-unquote, discern the future, give people important things about the spiritual world, which is obviously very important. But we'll read about the account in here, in Acts, the 16th chapter. There's a couple things I want to look at. And then we'll kind of tie it all together. And then hopefully we'll have enough time to see that last episode of Paul, his final, I think it's episode 6, the final journey of his, where he goes to Rome. He's in chains. He writes the epistles, the prison epistles to the followers, and that's that. So, all right, let's get into it. So, Acts 16. So let's take a look at this, and this goes back to our discussion about the difficulty that Paul had very early on convincing the Jews, the Jewish believers, that they had to put away the law. In other words, the law wasn't going to save them. Put it away. Imagine growing up in a certain idea, certain customs and rituals, and then all of a sudden someone comes along and says, okay, this individual has fulfilled all of those things in his death and in his resurrection. And you're like, I don't know about that. So here's an example. We know that Paul and Timothy, as we're going to see, were very close. Paul looked at Timothy as a son. Timothy looked at Paul as a father. But let's just look at this. Then came he, chapter 16 of Acts, then came he to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jew and believed, but his father was a Greek. So already we have, could be a potential issue here, right? Father was a Greek, had no interest in any of the customs, right, of the Jews as far as his own person is concerned. I'm sure he wasn't circumcised, because we know Timothy wasn't circumcised. So that one aspect of that physically made you a Jew, Timothy hadn't been done to Timothy, which is interesting. Even though we know from this account that his mother was a devout Jew and his grandmother as well was a devout Jew. So they knew the law. But this family dynamic in this relationship obviously caused Timothy's mother to make the determination that he wasn't circumcised. And this just kind of popped in my head. What part did the male? I'm sure a pretty significant part in the ancient world. What part did the father play in kind of bringing him to the not the temple but to the synagogue and have that ritual performed? I don't know, but it wasn't done on Timothy, and he was half Jew and he was a half Greek, and we're going to see this. We see this a lot. Right, this kind of combination of cultures, which is going to bring about ultimately, Christianity as we know it, which was well reported of by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. Him would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. And as they went through the cities, they delivered them the decrees for to keep, that were ordained of the apostles and elders which were at Jerusalem. So here was Paul because of, the importance of the ritual, number one, but also pushback from some of the Jews, the early Jews that were converts to Christianity. They were still hanging on to circumcision. Another interesting thing is, if we look at the later chapters in Acts, it seems as if Paul brought Timothy into the court of the temple. They recognized Timothy because he wasn't circumcised. He hadn't had that ritual performed on his person, that he was forbidden from going into the temple, okay, into the section for the Jews. And that it caused an uproar at Jerusalem, which was the catalyst for him going to Felix and Festus, so on and so forth, that type of thing, and Bernice towards the end of Acts. I haven't really done a deep dive on that, but that's pretty interesting to me, right? And so this is an example of Paul using his knowledge of the Jewish world and his knowledge of the Greek world to, in a way, kind of placate some of the early day believers of Christ, which is interesting. I think that goes hand in hand with what Paul says, for the Jew I became a Jew, for the Gentile I became a Gentile. He accentuated certain things of the gospel message depending upon who he was talking to. And I think this was the case. But this is really the beginning of a very close relationship where Timothy is the son to Paul. They love each other. They work well together. Paul is going to inspire Timothy, who is younger, obviously, to do great things as the leader of the bishop of Ephesus, right? If you remember from last week's class, Paul almost really got killed in Ephesus, right? Because he pushed back on Alexander the silversmith and Diana of Ephesus, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is where we're at. Now, let's look at the slave girl. And it came to pass as we went to prayer, a certain damsel possessed with the spirit of divination met us, brought her masters much gain. They were making a pretty good living off of this little scam they were running. The same followed Paul and us and cried, saying, These men are the servants of the Most High God, which show unto us the way of salvation. So she was telling the truth. But it grieved Paul because of the situation that this girl was in, I believe, and the whole situation and what it represented. And so it grieved him. It upset him. Every time they walked by, this girl goes, There they are! There they are! It's interesting that Paul puts an end to it. I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And he came out at the same hour. And this is obviously going to cause major trouble and upset in Philippi. And when her masters saw that the hope of their gains was gone, they caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace and the ruler. So that's kind of the outcome of that interaction there with this girl that had the spirit of divination. Paul put an end to it, and because of that, the populace of Philippi pushed back on that. Just like Paul is in Ephesus, and he starts talking about the gospel and, talking about Jesus Christ doing away with Diana of Ephesus, and the people, what happens? Well, they push back on him as well. And so you can see the power of the culture of the Greeks and the Romans at this time. They weren't pushovers. They believed what they believed, and they weren't going to let an upstart Jew like Paul to tell us who to worship and who not to worship. Okay? You're a nobody from a whacked out province on the edges of the Roman Empire, right? You have no power here. But Paul did have power, and it took a while, but eventually that whole pagan system in Rome is going to come crumbling down, for the most part. All right, so we are introduced to a sister called Lydia here, okay? And in the 16th chapter, we find out that and on the Sabbath, we went out of the city by a riverside where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spoke unto the women which resorted there. And a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of by Paul, and her whole household, brothers and sisters, are baptized. Okay, so there's some interesting things here. It has been supposed that there was not enough Jewish males in Philippi at this time to have a synagogue. Okay, you needed 10 adult males in order to set up a synagogue according to the customs of Judaism. Remember that the idea of a synagogue came out of the Babylonian captivity. Okay, this is when we find the first synagogues being formed in the land of Babylon. Okay, because their temple was destroyed. They didn't have a central location where they could go to perform all of the rituals. There was a time of darkness, that 70-year period. But they just didn't throw up their hands and say, woo-hoo, yes, that's the way it is. They did something about it. And so they set up these synagogues, and the synagogue itself is going to be the center of the community outside the temple. So when the temple is rebuilt, you now have synagogues in different areas of Israel, but you also have the temple as well because it's going to be rebuilt. But the idea of the synagogue and the institution of the synagogue is going to continue in Israel and also outside of Israel. And does it continue today? Of course it does, right? We have synagogues all over the place. Some of them are called temple. There's one about a half mile down the street here on the right-hand side, okay? We go by it all the time. And so I think there is an incredible spiritual lesson in that. That despite the horrific nature of really losing your identity and your culture and your religion and your family and things that you love, and you feel as if God has abandoned you. We have Psalms about that. One that comes to mind, the 44th Psalm. All right, all day long we are slaughtered as sheep. Paul uses it in Romans to talk about the persecution that was happening during that time. But they used the best in a very bad circumstance. In other words, they made the best of a very bad circumstance, okay? And they did two things. We talked about the synagogues. The other thing that they did, which was very important, they made sure that they had all of their holy writings, okay? This is when all of the holy writings that we know as the Old Testament, right, they're going to be compiled. Because before then, which is wild, there was a chance that those holy writings would be lost to history. Remember what happened with Josiah. Remember this incident with Josiah? Josiah, righteous king. He is instituting all of these reforms. He's rebuilding the Temple Mount that had been not destroyed but left in disrepair. And while they're doing that, what did they find? Copy of the law. No one knew about it. It literally was buried. And once they read it, Josiah, what does he do? He rends his clothes, right? Which was a symbol of extreme upset, right? Just really upset about, because he read Deuteronomy. It was a scroll of Deuteronomy, and he read all. Remember the blessings and the cursings? He's going to read all of this. Okay, and this is kind of the beginning. Even though they're going to be destroyed by Babylon, the reformation of Josiah began before Babylon came, before Nebuchadnezzar came. And it was so strong, and God's hand was on it, that it is going to grow and prosper in the land of captivity. And then, that faith and that strength, that spiritual strength is going to come back into the land and cleanse the land of all of the idolatry that was going on during that time. So I think it's an incredible story. And so anyways, Lydia is most likely is a Jewess, okay, living here, continuing to pray. There was a tradition that if there was no synagogue, you would go to a body of water, particularly for women. Women were doing a lot down at the river, particularly having to do with, the wash and carrying water for cleaning, carrying the water for drinking. Very labor intensive. Lydia most likely was a wealthy widow. Why do we say that? Well, if you were a merchant of purple, you were making some good money. All right? It'd be like, well, what do you do for a living? Well, I own my own gas and oil company. Oh, okay. right? So I'm not saying that it's just like she's making billions and billions of dollars. Most likely, she was wealthy. She had a nice little business that maybe her husband, had set up. She may or may not have children that were helping her. She certainly had what's called a household. And so when we read about households in the ancient world, we're not just talking about intimate family members, sons, daughters, wives, that type of thing. Remember that in the ancient world, you had extended families living in one domicile, one area. And as the family grew and their wealth grew, they would add on, just like we do today. But you would have generations living together. Additionally, you would also have slaves. All right? You would have your servants, they were slaves, and they were part of the household. A lot of these household slaves, brothers and sisters, knew nothing else. They were born into slavery. They were born into that household. They were little children, and they grew up in this house. And as they grew, they got certain jobs as a slave. So they would know anything else. And a lot of times, a lot of these slaves that had grown up in families, in households, in these homes, they were loved. They had close relationships with them. That doesn't mean that they weren't slaves, but they were treated very well. Okay, household slaves. All right? And so, it's a Turkish town now. It's known for its carpet, right? Was a householder, which most likely meant that she was a widow. There was a dye-making guild that was well-respected in Philippi. So it was known. So when the Bible says that she was a seller of purple, that coincides with extra-biblical type of writings, which says that there was an actual guild. In other words, all the dye guys got together, right? And they're like, yeah, we're the purple dye guys. And, they came up with their own guild. They set, I'm sure that they set prices. They had distribution that they took care of. Just like today. You have a lot of things that you have to worry about today in a guild, having some type of community where you can go to get help and stuff like that. They would give each other loans, right? So, it was like a whole business situation. So this was what Paul was, kind of dealing with from an economic point of view. And here, Paul is using this situation, Lydia down by the river, okay? And it reminds me, brothers and sisters, of the 137th Psalm. We don't have to turn to it, but by the rivers of Babylon, okay? There we hung our harps, right? For they that wasted us required from us a song. How can we sing the Lord's song in a situation like this, right? Psalm 137. And so this was a traditional thing, too, that when you were outside of Jerusalem, right, you would go down to the river to pray, all right? You would go to the river, and that's where you would pray. I think it had to do with kind of the living waters aspect of it, right? The moving of the waters, an open area as well, most likely, where people could go. And this was a traditional thing that would happen, particularly in smaller Jewish communities. And this is where Paul finds these people, down by the river, right? And, he's going to preach the gospel, starting with Lydia's household. They're all going to be baptized, all right? And so, when we think about baptism today, we have an examination, and I think, some of us that have been involved in different ecclesias, some examinations are like, you better know your stuff, right? So I don't think that took place here. I don't think there was a long, in-depth examination, but they were baptized into the saving name of Christ, and they took on the saving name of Christ as well. Because here's the thing, whatever religious beliefs your master had, you had. All right? Oh, that's against my religious beliefs. Oh, is it? Oh, no one cares. And so what would happen would be, and in the ancient world, that wasn't a big deal to most people. It's like, okay, yeah, it's like, yeah, we're all worshiping really the same pantheon of gods. I call them this, I call them that. They took different ideas and mixed it all up, that type of thing. Yes, Chris. You caught me taking a breath. Go ahead.
I was going to use the opportunity you mentioned genesis of my question is, when Paul says to the Thessalonians that do not be confused, that the coming of the Lord will not take place until the first apostate system,
Mm.
other tradition be revealed, and that this is being held in check for the time being, but once that is released, these events take place and so forth. So I always thought that was the idea that Rome would not allow religions to flourish, and kept this down until a future date. But yet we're seeing, at least at this time, that all these Roman colonies are following many gods. So is there something that happens after this in a change?
Yeah, so it is interesting to kind of look at the process, right, of this. But during this time, yeah, it was absolutely persecuted, because the big thing with the Christians was they refused to offer incense to the emperor. They refused, because the emperor was considered a god, a living god, and they refused to recognize any god greater than Yahweh. And so the Romans are like, well, this is seditious, and so they cracked down on that. The interesting thing, Chris, is they never cracked down on the Jews. And it's really genius that Paul, obviously God's hand, is going to use these Jewish areas throughout the Roman world. The Romans really had no problem with the Jews. Even though they were monotheistic, they recognized the Jews as an ancient people from the ancient world, and that they were still around. And by the basis of them still being around for 2,000 years, 1,500 years, that gave them legitimacy. You see what I'm saying? And so the Romans are like, okay, the Jews are legitimate. They're part of the, little weird, little cuckoo when it comes to religion, but okay, we can do business with them. The Christians are going to come out of the Jewish system, and then they're going to be much more aggressive against the Roman system. We're not doing anything you say to us. You can burn us. We don't care. We're not bowing down to the system. The Jews made a determination as saying, hey, we're going to follow our community right here, but for the most part, we're going to keep our mouths shut, unless we're attacked. The Christians are like, we're not keeping our mouths shut, and we're not offering to the emperor. And boom, this is where the persecution really starts to hit. Okay. All right.
Rich, I was reading a book the other day, and it was on early church history, and they were talking about the Romans were referring to the Christians as atheists.
Yes.
Which I thought was, I was so confused as I was reading this book, but it was because, they didn't believe in all the Roman gods.
Right,
to think of the Christians as atheists was bizarre to me.
Yes, right. Yeah. But that they looked at it, it's like you believe that there's only one supreme God. It's like, that's crazy talk to them. You're an atheist. Yeah. Thank you both for those comments. Okay,